Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's coffee chat with UNA-NCA.
Thank you, Shayna. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's Coffee Chat program, a series of the UN Association of the National Capital Area, one of the largest and most active chapters of the UN Association of the USA. Along with over 200 chapters across the country, we represent the largest movement of advocates dedicating to raising awareness about the vital work of the UN and to building a strong US-UN partnership. Since the spring of 2020, the Coffee Chat series have been highlighting timely issues and attracting participants within and beyond the DMV area. I would be remiss if I don't encourage those out there who are not yet members of our organization to join and get involved in our many programs and activities, ranging from human rights to sustainable development, peace and security, and much more. Today's Coffee Chat will explore the impact of climate change on human displacement, current legal frameworks for supporting climate refugees, and the link between human health, safety, and the environment. Climate change is the defining crisis of our time, and disaster displacement, one of its most devastating consequences. Entire populations are already suffering the impacts, but vulnerable people living in some of the most fragile and conflict-affected countries are often disproportionately affected. Refugees, internally displaced people, and the stateless are on the front lines of the climate emergency. Many are already living in climate hotspots, where they typically lack the resources to adapt to an increasingly hostile environment. The domino effect of disaster upon disaster, triggered by climate change battering already impoverished communities, leaves them no time to recover. As of 2020, nearly 80 million individuals have been displaced due to conflict or persecution. Climate change is expected to permanently displace upwards of an additional 200 people by 2050, leaving another 50 million at risk of death due to sea level rise, unprecedented flooding, and continental drought. By 2030, at least 60 million people are forecast to migrate from sub-Saharan Africa towards North America, many likely to seek asylum in the United States. And as you heard from our promotional materials, current immigration and asylum policy fail to define a climate refugee category, thus lacking mechanisms for legal entry, resettlement, or workforce integration. However, hope is on its way because in 2021, we saw a shift in US climate policy with the recommitment to the Paris Climate Agreement and the executive order on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. Many thanks to all of you for participating, to our speakers for taking time to join us for this timely discussion. And now, our Managing Director of Advocacy and Policy Strategy, Shayna Weiser, will take it from here and moderate the discussion. Shayna?
Thank you so much, Paula. Thank you to our speakers, and thank you all for joining us today. We have a very exciting lineup. And before we dive into it, we want to hear from you. Please participate in the chat throughout today's call. We'll be spending the last 10 minutes or so pulling questions from the audience. So make sure we hear from you in there. Like Paula said, 2021 is a unique year in terms of US climate policy due to some recent shifts. That said, we don't really know precisely how many people are under threat of displacement by 2050 due to climate change. IOM in 2008 cited that it would be 200 million, and then the Institute of Economics and Peace in 2020 cited that it could be up to 1.2 billion people. But at minimum, we can anticipate that we'll see an increase in persons displaced due to extreme weather, hurricanes and wildfires, sea level rise, lack of arable land, and more. Now for today's chat, we'll explore climate change through the lens of its impact on human health and security, with particular attention to displacement. When we look at the Marshall Islands or Fiji or Vanuatu, there's a risk not only of becoming uninhabitable due to flooding and droughts, but also sea level rise. However, like Paula mentioned, the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees does not recognize persons displaced by climate change as refugees under international law. The term refugee only describes a person fleeing war or persecution who has also crossed an international border. That leaves us with a number of questions. What happens when, after hurricanes devastate national infrastructure, create conditions for violence, scarcity of resources, and regional instability? We then have unaccompanied minors and families traveling north from Guatemala or Honduras to seek asylum within the United States. Should they also be considered climate refugees? And how are climate disasters shaping our current migration landscape as well as our projected future? There's a great deal of ambiguity over what specific legal protections persons displaced due to climate change are entitled to, which then impacts humanitarian capacity to respond. What happens when a person doesn't cross an international border but is still internally displaced? I want us to leave today with an understanding of the existing legal frameworks and barriers for supporting persons displaced by climate change, as well as the unique challenges they face. My aim is to situate our broader conversation on the link between human health and security and the environment through this lens of displacement. Now, to get us started, I want to start with Pablo, who's joining us all the way from Costa Rica representing IOM. Pablo, in 2020, the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center noted that of the 33.4 million new displacements in the world, almost 25 million were due to disasters. Can you give us a sense of how the climate crisis is creating conditions of instability that prompt people to migrate or to seek asylum?
Thank you very much, Shana. Thank you very much for inviting me. And I'm looking forward really to the discussion and to the questions from the audience. Yeah, you're starting with a great point, right? Because the IDMC report that you mentioned is sort of the first go-to evidence we have or data we have on environmental migration, right? I mean, it's often what we lead with, right? How many new displacements have been recorded due to disasters? Now, if we look at sort of the framework we work in, that's the hazard exposure vulnerability framework, right? And so we look at what are the hazards that have provoked these movements, what's the exposure of communities, and what's the vulnerability of these communities, right? And why are they impacted by disasters? Now, you also have to keep in mind that it is way easier to capture displacement due to sudden onset, what we call sudden onset hazards, right? So typically in the IDMC report, you have strong numbers on floods, on hurricanes, on earthquakes, seismic activity. However, capturing data on slow onset processes, so the things that we referred to before, sea level rise, desertification, land degradation, is much more difficult. So what I would say, and I don't want to take long because I really hope that we can have a sort of discussion. I would say that the conditions that the climate crisis creates are twofold. On one side, we know that there's a relation between the climate change and the potential increase in the frequency and intensity of extreme events. But also, we got a slower impact of climate change in terms of eroding resilience in communities. When we have communities that have been suffering long-term impacts of climate change, then we get the situations in which they are less resilient to disasters. And that's sort of when displacement occurs.
Mm-hmm. And we'll dedicate some time today to talk about climate resilience and community resilience in different settings. So something we'll certainly be circling back to. But Carl, I want to move over to you. What are the existing legal protections for persons displaced due to climate change? In particular, if we're looking at the US, what are the protections that refugees are guaranteed by their refugee status that climate migrants don't qualify for? And how does this then impact access to education, jobs, healthcare, and the like? Sorry, Carl, you're muted.
It's hard to answer the question you asked. And I think that's the key point here. Because you asked, about climate refugees or people displaced by climate. And I think that that's a really hard thing because there are a few people you can truly say they were displaced because of climate. There are a lot of people who are living in situations of multiple stresses. It's a developing, it may be a developing country, it may be poor neighborhoods, and they are exposed to climatic stresses. They're also exposed, using the framework that Pablo described, they may not have a lot of resilience. And so the decisions that people make to move, whether it's internally or internationally, these tend to be for multiple reasons. I mean, there are a few, the villages that are just kind of falling into the ocean. Okay, those are because of climate change. Well, maybe. In Maryland, about half of the sea level rise is because of sea level rise. The other half is because the state is sinking because of the post-glacial tectonics. And so, again, there are all these different factors that come in. I think this is why it's so difficult to answer this question. And so one of the things that we've been working on, and includes Shane and myself at ELI, Yuko Hamada, who's with IOM, she's in the audience here, and Erin Daly and Jimmy May at Delaware Law School, is saying, okay, if you want to answer that question specifically, there's very little. If you can tie the and we're proposing a different way of looking at it, but if you look specifically at that, if there's a conflict that can be tied to climate change and they're fleeing conflict, they have protections under the Refugee Convention, not because of climate change, but because of the conflict and persecution associated with that. There's some new emerging law around human rights. It has nothing to do with refugees. And, but the question of, would forcing somebody to return violate human rights protections and dignity? And there was a case before the UN Human Rights Commission on this, involving New Zealand. And ultimately it was almost a Solomonic judgment where they basically said, human rights protections apply, but not here, not yet, because it's not imminent enough. And so, they staked a claim, but then they did not force New Zealand to do anything. So it's a marker there. We could talk more about the framework that we're talking about, but I think that part of this is, how do you think about the problem? And the reality is, how do you know if I am, moving because I have an opportunity and it's economic, or it might be family, or it might be for my health, or it is because of climate change. And Shana has led some very interesting work in this respect, dealing with Pacific Islanders coming to the United States. And they're not coming under the Refugee Convention. They're not coming under kind of any sort of human rights protection. They're coming because we have a compact of free association. And this is the heritage of the relationship that the US had to these islands as protectorates after World War II. And so there's free migration under this compact of free association. And these are people on the front lines. But you ask them why they come, the primary reason is almost never climate change. It's education, it's jobs, it's healthcare, it's family. If you ask them what are the reasons they're coming, climate change often shows up. You ask them if they're planning on going back, almost 80% say no. You ask them why, climate change. So I think this is another part of the migration you need to be thinking about. Why do people move? Why do they not move back? And sometimes climate change plays different roles in that.
Shana, Carl cited your work with Pacific Islanders. Could you expand on that, just sort of to illustrate in context what this looks like, what Carl's describing?
Sure. So it's been interesting because I think I mean, it is important that we do look at what climate change, can do, right, as a driver for different types of change. But I think by creating an idea that there's maybe like a climate crisis, or that everything is that singularly driven by climate change, it really clouds these overarching issues and the complexities with why people move, which means that also in doing so, we tend to miss some of the opportunities that are available to develop policies that enable the migration itself, as opposed to focusing on the climate element specifically. And so when it came to the work that I was doing alongside Carl with the Pacific Islanders, it was under the original idea that these are small islands in the Pacific that are obviously experiencing sea level rise, saltwater intrusion, land degradation, and failure of agricultural, means. And so it was an idea that we understand that climate change is happening, but by working with them, we could understand not only why they were moving, but what they needed in order to actually move in a way that enabled them to have a life that was meaningful to them. And so the work that Carl and I, along with Yuko and the others that Carl mentioned, from the Delaware Law School, we're developing this concept of migration with dignity. Because what ends up happening is when you're focusing on something like climate itself, you're not really building the types of mechanisms necessary to support transitioning livelihoods, or appropriate education connections. And so what we would see is that people were moving for this variety of reasons. Of course, climate change is a factor, but when they moved, even under the Compact of Reassociation, they were not a migrant and they were not a citizen. And so they lived in a type of limbo that meant that they would, if they got a job, they would pay into the healthcare system, but they wouldn't necessarily receive benefits. Or if they had a particular trade or job status in the islands, they were very rarely able to get a similar or equal job in the US. They'd have to go back to school, their certificates weren't recognized. And so a lot of the transition of our work has been focused on, okay, yes, climate is a contributor, but the focus really needs to be on ensuring that the right policies and approaches are in place to support migration, regardless of what type of migration it may be.
Sure. So if I'm understanding correctly, there's quite a bit of risk in overstating or perhaps over-focusing on the role of climate in driving migration, as opposed to looking at sort of the framework from a broader lens. Pablo, when we're talking about then unique vulnerabilities,
I just want to be a little careful here. There is risk in overstating it, in part because your solutions aren't reflecting what the problems are, or whether it's the push or the pull. What's driving people away from a place or what's pulling people to a place. And so I think that there is often political and rhetorical power in saying this is climate change, but it's often, the reality is it's much more complicated. And I want to be careful about minimizing the role of climate change here. In many cases, it is a profound stress on a society. But whether people migrate, whether they migrate temporarily, whether there are other coping mechanisms that are implemented, climate change is a huge driver, but it's not the only thing. And we also see how societies respond, both socially, culturally, and governmentally. That has and for that matter, institutions like IOM, that has a profound effect on whether people migrate, how they migrate, where they migrate, and everything else. I want to be careful about kind of overly diminishing climate change here, but putting it in its appropriate context.
If I may just very quickly, Shana, before your question, I'm sorry because we're already overtaking your questions, but no, but because Carl was saying, right, we shouldn't either overstate or understate, and there are many factors, right? And I think one sort of good example is what we call the northern countries of Central America, right? Which is a lot of where the attention has focused on these past weeks, right? So places like Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, right? So we know these are places where there's a high toll of climate change in terms of droughts, and we got sort of hurricanes November last year, right? And we also have evidence that some people are moving because of the hurricanes, but some people were also moving before the hurricanes, right? And people have been moving forever from these places, right? I mean, El Salvador is a country with a high percentage of migration, and in particular migrants living in the United States, right? And so migration occurs, climate change is a driver, and we also have to think about how climate change influences the other drivers, right? Which is sort of the framework we're working with, right? So in a place so in 2018, there was this massive movement that we call the caravans, right? And we got media articles that were saying everyone's moving because of climate change, there's been a terrible drought, people don't have to eat, right? And when we were asking the migrants, no one was saying climate change, right? Everyone was saying we need better jobs, we're fleeing violence, and we're looking for family reunification. So there was this discrepancy between sort of the media saying, right, climate change is a strong driver, and people saying, right, not in our case, right? But what's interesting here is that in those same surveys, we noted that a lot of people work in the primary sector, right, in agriculture in particular. And they're saying, oh, we need better jobs. And then you're thinking, right, hold on, maybe because there's a drought, they really cannot find work, right? So people identify their driver as economic, but there's also the climate sort of rationale behind that, right? And sort of fewer opportunities for work, debt, and all these things that are sort of related to climate change as well. So I completely agree on the avoiding underestimating or overestimating, but it's very hard still to really look at the percentage of impact that climate change has in the migration drivers.
Right. And is that in part because climate change, like droughts, like hurricanes, weakens or demolishes the infrastructure that then creates scarcity of resources, that then creates that need for economic opportunity? Is that sort of where this disjuncture is from a maybe academic standpoint, or as researchers, we know that climate change is what's creating some of these conditions that prompt people to move, but for the average person, they're not thinking, well, it's because of the climate that there's no job opportunity. It's a factor of things, governance has to do with it, and then that's ultimately the driving force, so that we then consider them an economic migrant. Is that essentially what you're saying?
I mean, I'm not sure whether, infrastructure has a role to play, but there's other things as well, right? There's food security, there's employment, in the most sort of brutal cases like Hurricanes Eta and Iota in Honduras last year, there's destruction of communities, entire communities, right? And we know now there's anecdotal evidence of some people moving to the United States, and they're saying, oh, we lost everything in the hurricane, right? So it's not only infrastructure, it's also living conditions and losses of crops and food insecurity. So all these things mixed together, I would say.
Right, the compounding impact. That's very interesting, and something that I'm already seeing in the chat and that I want to circle back to as we close our conversation is on appropriate US response and policy making. But before we get into that, Pablo, I want to circle back to you and talk about disproportionate vulnerability, just because I think I, like many people, have seen the headlines. Women and girls are disproportionately impacted by climate change, will continue to be disproportionately impacted by climate change. And we know that they face unique challenges as migrants just in and of themselves. So can you speak to what specific barriers they face and sort of the role of IOM in taking those into account in your climate strategy and implementation of programs?
Right. Yes. So it's a very timely question because we just released a study last week with ECLAC, with the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, on the gender dimensions of environmental migration and disaster displacement in the Caribbean, right? And so indeed we hear that women and girls are affected differently than men, and there's reasons for that, right? But what we found through that study is that those specific impacts of climate change and climate migration happen throughout the migration process, right? So in communities of origin, we know, for instance, that women have less access to resources, less access to opportunities, to land holding, right? And so these are things that build resilience, right? When you have land, one of Carl was mentioning the coping strategies. In many places, when you get climate impacts, one of the first things you do is you sell livestock, or you sell a bit of land, right? Or you diminish food. And so we see that women who often don't have land, and they're the ones who first reduce their food intake, are the ones that are more affected by climate impacts. Then when we look at sort of the migration process, we also know that there's specific gender vulnerabilities in disaster displacement, for instance, right? So we know there's records of gender-based violence in shelters. Obviously, there's needs for protection. There's less access to resources, to food, to humanitarian assistance, less access to information. And we also see sort of women and girls having to take on a lot of tasks in these displacement scenarios, right? So they have to care for their family, they have to fetch water. So globally, women and girls are responsible in many cases for fetching water for the household, right? So these sort of tasks keep sort of piling on each other, right? And there's also evidence that women and girls have a harder time going back to their communities when that's possible, because they're less involved, for instance, in building work that can help in rebuilding communities. They have less access to resources, to stable livelihoods. And sort of the men are the ones who have an easier time sort of getting back to their house. So that's sort of the structure that we have. So we know that the traditional gender roles are what is driving sort of these differential vulnerabilities throughout the climate migration process.
And expanding on that point and taking into account all dimensions, including gender, to create, I guess we'd say, inclusive plans for community resilience, I want to turn things over to Shayna to get a sense of how your work with both NASA and previously with the joint UN-OCHA, UN Environment Unit has aimed to mitigate vulnerability and exposure to climate change. I'm curious as to how NASA utilizes Earth observation data, as well as your partnerships in humanitarian settings in order to support community resilience. And maybe you could share a specific example from your work.
Sure. So it's been an interesting transition to working with NASA, because I think that what I've seen is that obviously today we're in a place where there's a lot of data and a lot of information that's out there. But when you're working in a humanitarian context, you want to really make sure that we're not just developing maps or statistics and other analyses independent of the questions and the needs and challenges that are going on the ground. And so I think historically you see a lot of data scientists that are more from the research angle that are very interested in addressing more the innovations and what's possible with Earth observations. But the application side is really where a lot of what your question is about. You know, this is where it lies, is in how we can make data products and information systems and portals relevant and usable to people that are working in fragile or you know, complex settings. So I have a number of partnerships that I manage. One is with Mercy Corps, and a lot of the work, there's two prongs essentially to the work. One is looking in Mali at the development of 2 dams along the Niger River Basin that will effectively cut off a key area of the Niger Delta that provides a lot of resources to local agro-pastoralists, farmers, and herders, people that are tied to transhumanists. And so one of the things we're trying to do is not only understand, you know, what communities we're trying to build resilience to, but what shocks and stresses occur in the region. And then in partnership with Mercy Corps, we develop then, or we help support through science, the policy options that they develop in concert with national governments or with local communities. And so in this context, there's a few things to take stock of, I would say. One is that it really necessitates a systems perspective. In order to talk about resilience, we need to understand these interconnected elements. So we've got a team that's looking at, you know, water management and land management, and then the human dimension. So transhumanists and different, you know, there are a lot of people that are moving to where land is available for their for their cattle, right? And this can often lead to localized conflicts with people that are farming that area, that rely on it for other reasons. And so understanding the trends that are occurring in the region is something that we can do in partnership. And then we can also help support that type of understanding with the science that we have. And I think that part of your question was on this element of operationalization of our data. And it's another role that partnership really plays, because a lot of times we can, through Earth observations, which include satellite data, but also sensor networks that are monitoring, land change and water changes, and remote sensing. There's a whole suite of different things you can be looking at. A lot of times when these things are brought together, what you get is situational awareness. So it can tell you an idea of what those drivers of change and what change is happening in the region. But until you are able to work with a partner that can help you validate the data, it's not really decision ready. You can't make, you can't support decisions based on human lives unless you're ensuring that the data is also relevant and validated with the information from partners that we can get on the ground. And so it's a long way to resilience. None of this is an easy solution, but I think one of the benefits in working not only across the systems perspective is that you get an understanding of change over time that's happening in a particular region. It also, as you're looking at historical trends, you also get clear climate signals for where the extremes are and what those extremes looked like. So they give you a better understanding of what you're likely to see moving forward. That way it helps you better understand and create appropriate policies, and you're less likely to look at climate change as kind of a like a Sharknado, right? Like a massive event that is almost too impossible for any of us to really help mitigate or adapt to. And so I think a lot of the role of the partnerships has been in ensuring that we all understand what climate change looks like, what the appropriate scenarios are that we could be considering, and that through that combination of partnerships with science and humanitarian actors, we can build more resilient communities.
Shane, I wanted to come back to the question you asked earlier. I think it reflected a comment from Ed in the chat about what the US policy should be with respect to migration with dignity. And he was asking, wouldn't this open the doors for a flood of migration? I think that the people, when we talk about migration, we tend to focus overwhelmingly on whether somebody can come in. And I think that what we're trying to do is to extend the perspective in a number of ways. First of all, there's this question of, if you look forward long enough, you could foresee certain areas that will become uninhabitable quickly due to a catastrophe. And you have, from a policy perspective, you have a choice. Do you start migration early and before everything's wiped out, and before you have a pulse of people? The Sharknado that just, the idea being, can we do this in a way that enhances the absorptive capacities of the receiving countries, and in a way that people have dignity. They can choose when to move, and they can come with the skills and the assets, and not be just fleeing with the shirts on their back and maybe a bucket of their worldly belongings on their head. The second part of this is that we're trying to look beyond, can they get into the country? We're trying to look at what happens to them afterward. And so a lot of this has to do with the quality of life. Can they access services? Under what terms? Can they go to school? Are their professional credentials recognized? And when we were working in Arkansas, we saw people whose nursing credentials from the Marshall Islands, they're recognized by the state of New York, but not by the state of Arkansas. It's like, well, maybe we could, this observation led to some efforts to try to map, okay, what are the, because all of this it's just an administrative process in many cases. You say, okay, what do they learn in the Marshalls? Is there some measure of quality that you can be assured of? And what is required in Arkansas? And to map that and to adjust course. So that's what they're doing right now. And so there are a number of these very discrete measures that people can take to improve the quality of life after they arrive, which reduces the cost on the receiving society, not just the country, but also the communities. It helps them to integrate, it reduces tensions, and I think that it makes for a much more sustainable process. And so there will always be this question of how many people can get in. And that's, whether you are, whatever your beliefs are, this is the political reality. But we need to kind of extend that, that set of analysis and considerations. And so just to kind of close that point for Ed, I think that the migration with dignity isn't just a question of, letting everyone come in from everywhere, but it's also, so let's take a look at some of these other aspects. Under what circumstances do they have access to healthcare or to schools, or to, and how do we do this in a way that is equitable? But to kind of be looking at a lot of those other questions. Sorry.
Pablo?
Sorry. No, I just wanted to comment on what Carl was saying about the fact that indeed we're very much at the question, how many are going to come, how many are going to move, how many are going to cross the border, right? And so I think we have to keep in mind that we're still, international climate migration, it's still not the norm, right? The first movement is internal. The internal displacement data you quoted, Shane, at the beginning from IDMC, that's internal displacement. The World Bank projections for 2050, that's internal migration, right? I think we have to sort of counter the fear-mongering perspective of saying, there's a hurricane, we're going to have millions at the border, because people mostly get displaced. They go to the nearest shelter and they want to go back to their houses and their communities, right? Whenever that's possible, and even slow onset processes, they're mostly related to urbanization, right? And sort of cities in country increasing, right? So the World Bank Ramswell report, for those who are familiar, it says that, I don't know how many million now, but in Latin America, was 17 million people could migrate internally by 2050. Those are people who may leave, for instance, coastal areas of Guatemala and go to the city, which is supposed to be less exposed to climate impacts, right? So we're still talking internal migration to a large extent. However, I do agree with Carl and that migration perspective, and the fact that it is also necessary to prepare future migrants, because some of those movements are sort of inevitable to some extent, right? And it's about, when these people move, will they have the skills to seek job elsewhere? Will they have the skills to integrate in another community in the cities? We have in the region that I know best, which is Latin America and the Caribbean, we still have sort of unplanned neighborhoods and unplanned urbanization, right? And so that builds vulnerability, right? So that's an important part of this discussion. Where these migrants move, they leave the countryside, where do they go? They go to the large cities, right? So if we get the example of Peru, for instance, we published a study as well a month ago. Lima, so the capital of Peru, is a huge booming city, and yet that's the second largest desert city in the world, right? So there's a huge water stress in Lima. So you get all these millions of people coming in from the countryside, and they get to places that are also exposed, and so that's the sort of urban planning and integration discussions that need to happen to a large extent.
There was a question that I had noted for Shana, which was about the role of the built environment in urban infrastructure and development, advancing urban climate resilience. How do you integrate, Shana, if you could just get the conversation started, what does urban resilience look like? How does it differ from strategies elsewhere?
I mean, that's a very complex question, I'll be honest, but I think some of the things that I look at in my job and the things that I'm interested in are these areas that are similar to what Pablo was describing, where you end up having, this maybe, a city that may have had some planning and design elements, involved in it, but then you've got these different variations on urban and rural fringe areas and how those areas end up being developed over time, often unsustainably, often in a way that just perpetuates vulnerability. And so I think that there's also a lot of gaps when it comes to understanding how to manage those areas effectively. And so a lot of the focus I place on is like greater transparency and integration across like planning measures, but it also requires, I think, a lot of, there's a political process challenge in that people are not in office for very long periods of time, or there's corruption, et cetera, so that can really change the way things are designed as you progress. But we know that cities are increasing in size, right? We know that they're growing, and they're often growing in areas where you're seeing what may have started out as a slum area or an informal and temporary settlement is becoming more a formal part of the city. And so do you work to perpetuate that type of exposure and vulnerability, or do you work to, better understand it, better visualize what's going on, see these trends, and then implement improved planning measures that can really lift those areas up? And I think, with NASA, at least, it's the visualization effort that we end up helping a lot with, because I don't think a lot of times when you're planning, particular, like anything really, you're very focused on a particular area at hand, or maybe that what's within your governance structure. But there are a lot of things that happen outside of that that will inform how a city grows that may not be part of your purview. And so using Earth observations, using other types of integrated and interagency dialogues that can paint a better picture of like where energy needs to go, where we need to make sure that there are formal water, systems and structures for wash related elements. Things like that all end up being, they need to be a part of the conversation, but they're often lacking from the conversation, particularly in these rural urban divides, with informal settlements in particular. Carl?
I just wanted to jump in on 2 points. One, we're already seeing in certain places, like there's a front page article in the New York Times a few weeks ago about hurricanes, sea level rise combining to wash out roads on a regular basis. And how often do they rebuild? Who's going to pay for the rebuilding of all this? And so these are things that we are already starting to see in different places. The scary thing is that I think we're going to, there's a paper that is out there by Robin Craig and J.B. Rule, and they basically make the argument that the ship has sailed on 2 degrees C. There's no way we're going to make 2 degrees. We're not looking at 3 degrees either. Right now, the best science is saying if we take action now, we can contain it at 4 degrees C. And that is not more, that is different. And we are going to see things that we are not seeing. Sorry, I'm being vague.
Yeah.
They lay this out in much more detail, but it's one of these things that is going to, this is something that we really need to be thinking about now. And they focus only on the US and a whole series of legal questions and how do you start the migration now? And I think that this is, when I started working on this back in 2007, 2008, one of the first things I did, 2008, participated in an adaptation response working group for the state of Maryland. And the question was, what, Maryland, low-lying, what should Maryland do? And one of the first questions was, well, what's the sea level rise scenario that we're talking about? Because there were many different projections. And some of them were over 1 meter by 2100. And the word back from the political appointees were basically, you want something that people will believe. Because if they don't believe it, there will be one study and it will be over. And so you want to get people thinking about this. And I think that it's interesting to reflect on how far we have come in the 15 years. I mean, we still have a lot to do, but it's this question of what happens if we have 4 degrees C? What does the world look like? What do we need to do? And I think that some of it is, some of these no regrets measures, how do we invest? Where do we invest? But we also need to start looking hard at how often do we rebuild some of these things. And that is politically very difficult to tell a community that we're not going to rebuild.
I think we need to go read the the paper that you linked to after we get off this call. I want to jump to a question from Yuko Hamada in the comments, because Carl, to what you're speaking about, but this question is open to everyone. Yuko asks about the main gaps in the Paris Climate Agreement in addressing displacement and how you'd like to address those gaps. And I think even just expanding that question a little further, when we talk about climate adaptation policy or this new 2021 climate agenda within the US, more broadly, what are the gaps, whether relating to displacement or otherwise? What recommendations would you issue?
Are you addressing that to the panel?
Anyone can take, whoever wants to chime in first.
Well, I would say a couple of things. One, as a general matter, there's very little substantive. It's let's create a process, let's talk about this, let's develop more. And I think part of it is the potential impacts and the potential cost are staggering. I think that there are going to be, this is something that we're going to start feeling in our national and subnational budgets over the next 20 years. And it's not just coastal, tornadoes, Mississippi flooding, droughts. These are things that we'll feel domestically and things that we'll feel internationally. And so wildfires for that matter, and we find all sorts of things that we didn't even think about. It's like, wildfires, we're now cutting off power to reduce the impact, the likelihood that this is going to create wildfires. This is in California, one of the world's largest economies. And you get rolling brownouts and blackouts at times. I think that the issue is that there aren't any easy answers. And so I think a lot of this is going to be a question of finding partial solutions here and there and there. I don't think that there's going to be a global framework that everyone agrees on, and that's a binding legal framework. I think it's going to be much more of a toolkit approach. And I think this is why we've been working on the Migration with Dignity framework. It helps to think through these things and to see specific channels. And so, okay, how can we work through the COFA? How can we work, with the state of Arkansas? How can, and you start kind of working on this in very specific contexts, because I don't think the knowledge is there. And I certainly don't think the political will is there for anything meaningful at the global level. Not now and not in the next few years. And I think that the longer this goes on, the more difficult it gets to do something globally.
If I just may, yeah, because I do agree with what Carl was saying on the fact that there's a lot of processes, right? But also, I mean, we say before we shouldn't underestimate climate change. I don't think we should underestimate sort of the processes, because as Carl said, I mean, it is difficult to get sort of global consensus, right? And Yuko was mentioning the Paris Agreement, and the Paris Agreement created what we call the Task Force on Displacement that has produced recommendations on climate change and migration. We get from another side the sort of language that's on the Global Compact on migration. We get the wording of the Sendai framework. We have the UNA-NCA agenda. So fully agree with Carl that it's sort of a patchwork, sort of, right? So there's this framework here from climate, there's this framework from migration, there's this framework on disaster risk reduction. And so I would say that coherence is sort of a key word here, right? Because countries, they get all these frameworks at the global level, and they think, well, where do we start, right? And who leads this even, right? And in some countries, you get the migration people saying, oh, yeah, we need to include a category for climate migrants in the law. Example of Bolivia, for instance. Another country saying, oh no, we got to approach this from a disaster risk reduction perspective. Example of Honduras and Chile. We need to approach this from a climate standpoint. That's Peru and Belize and now Guatemala. So you see, I mean, you get these things where like, you don't know exactly who's leading, and at the same time, you're always missing people on the table, right? Because you need the climate perspective, you need the environment perspective, you need the land development, the urban, the agriculture, the city planning, the water perspective. So in every meeting I've been, everyone says, oh, we're missing someone, right? And it's impossible to get everyone on the table, but it's necessary because of that coherence building, right? And I would say we're sort of a very, very interesting point in which we got now sort of ideas of what needs to be done through these global frameworks. Some countries, they know nationally what needs to be done. Example of Peru, who's in the framework along climate change, they're building a plan of action on environment, on climate migration. Chile, similar process, Mexico in the NDC. And now it's about, right, so what does it mean concretely, right? So what does that mean? I mean, who's gonna do what, basically, right? And we got some examples, and Shana was saying, right, the urban planning is crucial. Countries are sort of trying to address the vulnerabilities in terms of don't build where it's dangerous, where it's exposed, right? Reduce the population density where it's exposed, reduce population density in coastal areas. We got countries addressing that. But as Carl said, it's a patchwork thing, right? It's not a one size fits all, right? All the countries are saying, right, let's develop humanitarian visas, TPS-like systems, right? Where you get a disaster, at least let's get people in, right? And they can access our territory. It's a lot of different things at the same time, and it's sort of different levels in different countries, right? So that makes it confusing, but very interesting.
Mm-hmm. And to that point, within the US, I believe it was last year that Senator Ed Markey introduced a bill to, I don't know necessarily that it would change the definitions of any of our legal protections to expand to include climate change, but it was essentially humanitarian visas for persons displaced by climate. Is there, and this is a question for the full panel, is there value in looking within the US legal system and not just humanitarian visas, but seeking opportunities for reclassification and expanding definitions? Or is that still not really getting to the heart of the issue as we opened up our conversation? Is that still focusing too much on, you know, we know that no one's truly a climate refugee, but rather there are a number of factors that impact human mobility and the choice or forcible displacement of persons in the US and abroad. What do you think? Maybe Shana, we could start with you.
Well, you know, I do. I think I mean, if I build off a little bit of what Pablo was saying, even though like we've got all of these different frameworks and, you know, and all of them seek to do something complementary, but there is no coherence. And even in the US government, which may be, you know, used as an example largely to the rest of the world, there's a lot of gaps in transparency for how we report, how we truly understand those who are impacted, what marginalization looks like, you know, how to report disaster and loss information. And so without a clear picture, I think, you know, pursuing processes like this almost complicate the discussion. It's my preference that we lean on getting more robust information, that we are able to be more transparent in how we approach these, the different types of movement that are occurring, because I think also, you know, there's a whole gap as well with building off what Carl said, with communities that live in coastlines. Like, maybe they're not going to rebuild, but are they going to pay for, is the government going to pay for people to be relocated? You know, what does it mean to really reset a lot of the economic ties that we have when it comes to growth and expansion and things like that? And so my interest is always on focusing on how we can develop policies that can meet people where they are, as opposed to, you know, specifically addressing one portion of the population and hoping that that will act as a broader salve to a very complex narrative.
Interesting. There's quite a bit that we have not, I mean, I think if we've touched on anything in our conversation, it's that this is a very complex a problem. And we didn't really get a chance to, I mean, we could spend hours talking about urbanization or the link between the environment and conflict, even more explicit linkages between climate change and public health. So I guess to our audience, we'll have to stay tuned for parts 3, 4, 5 of this conversation, because by no means will we solve this crisis today. But I wanted to pose a question to the panel. If perhaps we can end on a note of hope. What are some important, maybe not innovations, because Shana was just telling us about how sometimes we focus too much on the innovation and not the problem at hand, but what are some important developments, policies that we should be following, that we should be advocating for as ways to mitigate, alleviate in some ways small aspects of this crisis, to try and be as proactive as possible in mitigating the future crisis? Maybe Carl, you can start, and then we'll go to Shana, and then Pablo can close our conversation.
I would start by, on a positive note, if this is an area you're interested in, there's job security in it. We're going to be dealing with this for a while. In terms of specific things we should be pushing for, my own head has been very much in this migration with dignity framework that we've been developing. We hope to launch the publication in the coming month or two, just cleaning it up for publication, and we'll have some discussions around that. But I think that there are many processes that are underway. And I would say whatever one you can work on. You know, what we are trying to do is to find approaches that work, even in just like this piece or this piece. So if it's at the state level in Arkansas, or you're working in Darfur, whatever it is, I think that some of what we're trying to do is to just get all the different pieces to see, where does it work? Where does it have problems? Why? To learn so we can kind of integrate and adapt as we move forward in our own policy recommendations. And I think it also builds political support when countries can say, we did this and this, and so, you know, you can build that support for political action when you have those experiences that the countries, even if the country didn't do it, as this NGO or that church or whatever, but they can talk about what was done in their own country. So.
Shana.
I agreed with Carl on the job security element. I think what's also interesting is that it's not just security from a climate change perspective. But in addition to rejoining the Paris Agreement, we're also, you know, in discussions about rejoining the Global Compact for migration, right? And so there's a lot of resurging interest in, you know, this area of migration and all of the different complexities that it entails. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity moving forward under the current administration to start really helping define, you know, where the focus needs to be, what opportunities exist, and what you could do to be a part of all of that. And so I'm very hopeful and positive, I think, about where we're headed in that regard. And so I would just say, you know, certainly from a tangible perspective, it's been a pleasure to be part of the Migration with Dignity work, because we do look at, you know, what are the situations that migrants themselves are facing, and what could we be doing from a policy perspective, you know, to support, you know, the needs of people that are put in a variety of situations that move. And so getting, you know, broader, I think, support and the ability to talk a little bit more about that, I think moving forward will be something that I'm also looking forward to. And I'll stop there.
Pablo, your closing thoughts.
Yeah, no, I feel the overwhelming responsibility now. No, I agree with what Shana and Carl was saying, right? I mean, there's things that are going on, and I think we're the sort of keywords that are repeated oftentimes are preventing forced migration and addressing climate migration, right? So preventing is about, right, climate shouldn't be the driver of forced migration, right? People should not be forced to move, because we know that where there's forced movement and displacement, there's more vulnerability, right? Obviously, no one's saying, oh, people shouldn't move, because that's obviously a human right, but they shouldn't be forced to move, right? And that's sort of where that distinction comes in. And then addressing climate migration is sort of the things we've been talking, right? I mean, what happens to these migrants? Where do they settle? How do they live? Where do they work, right? So I think there's progress in both perspectives that's going to need to be followed through. And obviously, we have to consider that climate change is going to put increased pressure on the needs, right? I mean, the more global warming, the more climate change, the more needs it's going to be. And finally, and I'm not an expert on US politics, but what we have to look for on my side is the follow-up to the executive order of 4 February, in which White House asked the APNSA to develop a report on climate migration in 6 months, right? So that would take us, if my calculations are right, to early July. So that report on my side is going to be crucial, right? So for those interested in the topic, I think that's going to be where the positions are developed and what are the needs. And it takes wording from the Paris Agreement and the UN Convention on Climate Change in terms of speaking of migration, displacement, and planned relocation. So the sort of movements we talked about. And so that's a big framework to follow on the US side of things.
Sure. Thank you so much to the 3 of you. And there have been a lot of resources shared today that we will be circulating in our follow-up email to everyone who joined us. But I just want to take a moment. Shana, Carl, Pablo, this was so informative. Thank you so much for allowing us to also add a little bit of nuance to our understanding of some of these key crises that we engage with, refugee rights and climate change. To see the intersection between the two has been so fascinating and incredibly valuable. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to our participants for your time. Special thanks to the advocacy team, as always, for making sure these run smoothly. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we will see you at the next coffee chat. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.